To win that type of position as well, just one pawn up, all on the same side of the board, really just outplayed Denis in a position that was probably closer to a draw than a win.
Yeah, it felt like when the players, once they're under 30 seconds, he just read the position very well. All of his moves came quick, and even though it was quite equal, a little bit of pressure, and the tactics were flowing. And you don't want to give Hikaru like just the position. Opposite bishops, he's very good at practical blitz positions.
Exactly right, and that's a huge skill. That's like a big part of blitz chess. You don't always need a winning position. You need a position that is easier to play, clear plan, where you can apply pressure on the clock. Hikaru is simply one of the best in the world at doing that.
Well, you mentioned, will Denis get off to a good start? This is opposite of his match yesterday.
That's right, and it's difficult kind of loss as well. It's not, you weren't just outplayed, outclassed in a big way. It was more minute, impressive technique from Hikaru. But now, Denis with the white pieces. I feel like you haven't really had a bad start to a match when you still have the white pieces to play. There is this push that you have when playing white. So let's see what Denis can do here. Obviously, a lot of space currently on the queen side in Denis's favor. And usually in these positions, you will see at some point these light squares in the center start to be controlled, whether it's knight e4, knight d5. And in contrast, to control some of these dark squares, probably white does need to play the move e3 because you don't want to hand over everything to black.
Well, talking about the opening choice here, Denis went for the English. We didn't see that much yesterday. And in this position, there's been no exchanges, rich positions, rich middle games, lots of maneuvering. At some point, pawns will be traded off, but the players will maneuver as much as they can until then. But I like the opening choice because, yeah, no exchanges. It keeps many options open and a long game, which is what Denis likes.
Yeah, and it's interesting that he's switched things up because we were actually saying that's not usually what you expect from Denis, but I think that adaptability is really important in these long speed chess matchups. So very exciting to see this early on and wonder if it's something that he'll stick with, of course, pending success.
Wondering here if white will choose to play knight b3. I mean, you can maybe play queen c2. The d3 pawn's loose. You notice the light squared bishop up for white, very good, has the whole diagonal. And as a result, the d5 square is tendered for the rest of the game. Black does not have a good way of challenging the d5 square besides exchanges because if you ever, the c6 square is covered by that pawn on b5. So good control by Denis. I've noticed he's been up on the clock both games coming out of the opening, which we did expect heading into the SEC finals. He generally was one of the quicker players in the format.
Yeah, we very likely will see this knight on c5 challenged with bishop to a3. The other way that you can play is, a little bit more with f4, but feels like this knight should be challenged in some way. You want to play the move like knight d5, for example, but the a4 pawn needs attention, especially now that the rook has moved. I really expect this knight on c5 to be challenged and the move f4 in the future.
Yeah, I think you have to challenge the knight on c5 because otherwise a4 is loose for the rest of the game. You have to keep your knight on c3, e4 is hit. I'm not sure about f4 though, because if we want to trade off that knight on c5, then we're giving black the bishop pair. And if white chooses to play f4, maybe there's some risk with opening up black's bishop.
Yeah, an interesting plan might be to try to take the knight and then occupy the light squares and play something like h4, king h2, bishop h3. Try to trade that light squared bishop off while going for a plan involving knight d5.
Yeah, ideally, trade the light squared bishops off and contain the dark squared bishop, which means we don't touch the f-pawn and just play on the light squares as you mentioned.
And queen e7 had to get off the d-file because otherwise bishop takes c5 would force b takes c5 here. It looks like black's intending to recapture with the d-pawn. A definite edge to white though. This has been a successful opening, I think, early on for Denis. Again, we want to see what he's going to go for here. h4, actually dual purpose. King h2, bishop h3 to trade off the light squared bishop, but also h5. Black kind of wants to play f5, maybe open things up, help that dark squared bishop. So h5, I think, was as much of, if not more so, an idea than king h2.
No, I like your idea for sure. I mean, the real goal here, trade off the light squared bishops. Why? Because then white can install a knight on d5 and potentially have positions good knight versus bad bishop. Hikaru's hesitating to play f5 for the same reason that white's hesitating to play f4. f5 opens up this monster. So we're going to see more maneuvering here, but bishop h3 is ready to be played.
And the thing about bishop h3 is that if black would capture on h3, it's exactly what white wants. d5 square under white's control. But if white captures on e6, Hikaru might really consider f takes e6. I know it looks weird. Those might be the ugliest pawns you've ever seen, but boy, is it helpful to keep that knight out of d5.
Yeah, you can't afford to allow a knight to just stick itself on d5 permanently for the rest of the game. That would have to be played after bishop h3. I like what Denis is doing. It's a simple plan, but Hikaru did that in game 1. Just very effective, a little bit of pressure, and not much risk, which suits him.
B takes c5. And I mean, this is a decision that I think you don't make happily, right? This is a very interesting move. I thought for sure we were going to see d takes. I think this was because the pawns on e6 and e5 would be isolated if you take that d pawn and put it on b6. So perhaps this is to make that pawn structure better. But now I'm looking at that a pawn on a5, and it's just a little bit weak. You're highlighting the way that white could potentially take advantage.
No, I mean, after fe6, you know your knight can't jump on d5. So we have to optimize that knight. And the a5 pawn is isolated. And the main way to defend that isolated pawn is to put a rook on e8, which isn't very efficient. You can, if you reroute your knight to b3, black has to use resources, heavy resources to defend that, because you can't afford to give up an outside pass pawn.
And I'm starting to get ideas like, well, first of all, we are going to see that knight, I think, reroute. Knight c1, knight b3, tie a piece down. Then all of a sudden, I think I want to play rook h1 and g4. I start to get ideas of playing on the king side. So, and look at this. That's a great side. Shout out to the crowd there. I love that. I love that. We need a loud crowd, you know. This is what the live events are all about. So I love to see that, and I think that we might get a position that could still explode. It looks all locked up right now, Eric, but I think it's going to open up, and this move proves it.
For sure, and Hikaru's an active defender. He's playing c6. It's very provocative, but he doesn't want to sit and be ground down by Denis. This position for sure is very, very good for white. But we're talking about Hikaru here. He's looking for tactics, looking for ways to not allow white's conversion to be comfortable. You mentioned the g4 idea, that's good. But why is c6 a provocative move? Well, look at the position. d6 now is a target.
Yeah, you can double up. Like the rook on h1 is not tied down. You can go back to d1. And I will point out, c6 was timed so that knight was not on c3. Because then white would probably capture it and put a knight on b5. But if white captures on c6 now, the rook is going to penetrate the b file. That's why white is not going to touch that pawn.
Another risk of Hikaru playing c6, if you ever exchange, which will happen at some point, otherwise it's a loose pawn the whole game, white will have a protected pass pawn.
Yep.
That's a huge endgame asset.
Exactly. And you know, black doesn't look like they're in a position to play the move g5. So this is a non-stop defensive game here for Hikaru. Not a pleasant position to be in. And you know, as time gets lower, I think at some point there is going to be a breakthrough.
We should also talk about the minor pieces. White's better. The knight, this is a close position, maneuvering position. Knights are good at that. This bishop, what's the issue? It's kind of blocked by the pawns. Blocked by the pawn on d6, pawn on e5. Doesn't have any scope over here. So that bishop on e7, you don't know what to do with it. And that's a huge problem for black.
Yeah, even though you might think about, how can I apply more pressure? Maybe the move f4, taking advantage of this pin from the queen on c3 to the king on g7. That could stand to activate the pieces as black might respond bishop f6. So I think rook d2 could be in some way supporting the move f4, tying that bishop down to the d6 pawn. You have ideas like knight takes on c5.
I'm looking at knight c5 at some point. There's some ideas, but Denis, we know, is a patient player. He's playing it when it works. He's not a big risk taker in terms of playing speculative sacks. White has many ways to just, you know, play on this game without taking risk, and still Hikaru's uncomfortable.
And the pieces are tied down to a5. You know, queen on c3, knight on b3, tying a queen and rook down to the defense of that pawn. Not ideal here. However, in terms of a guaranteed breakthrough, it's difficult to break through this position without also allowing a little bit of counterplay for your opponent. These are these moments where you wonder, is Denis going to allow a little bit to potentially get more in return?
I don't think so. I think he's more likely to play a move like rook b2, just repeat a little bit, shuffle a bit, rook b2. Why? Because maybe, if nothing else is working, try to play for b6.
Yep. Yeah, this move might get a question mark, but I really think following the engine here, you know, apart from the big moments, it's not going to be the most instructive because it's a position that both players are really shuffling in, trying to find that perfect moment.
You know, I like the knight on b3, and I think a couple moves ago, and rook d6 was very interesting, the exchange sack.
Yeah.
Maybe the issue is, if you exchange sack on d6 and black keeps the rooks on the f file, f2 is too weak.
And this was his plan, to take and bring the knight to c3. This was something that Hikaru maybe overlooked. I think the knight is really, really strong there. And this might actually cause Hikaru to look for something a lot more direct.
And Denis is under 20 seconds. The good thing is the position's pretty easy right now. There's no tactics to calculate, because that is a big time difference. And if we just do all the math, d6 is still defended.
Yep.
The queen leading on d3, you're not in position to ever take here in any circumstance. So that's why Hikaru's moving all the rooks to the f-file, because you don't want your knight pinned.
And so many endgames are going to be bad for Hikaru here. Knight versus bishop. You know, you have pressure on d6.
A5 is loose.
A5 is loose. d5 is hard for black to play. So again, it feels like only white is really pressing here. But Hikaru is such a good counterattacker. As soon as Denis takes a little bit of risk, Hikaru will get some counterplay.
I am noticing, though, the time advantage is disappearing. And that was the main advantage Hikaru has. Because Denis can play this on forever, catch up on the clock, and then, if he needs to, come up with a plan. At the end of the day, 50 moves, right? You got 50 moves before you have to push a pawn.
Exactly, and we actually see one right now. The move f4 was played. I'm wondering if we're even going to consider e5 here.
E5,
actually,
but f5 looks really, because it weakens the d5 square.
Exactly. No, without e5, I don't know what black does, and here we go.
Hikaru's
E5,
in trouble
F5.
here. His queen might be offside in future positions. Now the e4 pawn is disconnected from black's pieces. d6 is loose.
The knight is so strong on b5.
Maybe
the king is also just going to come over. Yeah, king g2. White doesn't need to do anything.
Rook e1, king f3.
This
White's
is looking
king
better
is better,
and better.
and black is stuck with this d6 long-term weakness.
Rook f3, rook takes e3. If you bring the bishop to h6 to defend the pawn, remember the d6 pawn is just, it's already hanging.
Yeah, maybe f6 first. You're hitting h5. There's too many pawns to take. Hikaru's going for active defense. Rook e6.
I think
Rook
it might be the only move. Rook b2 is
and
so
he's
strong.
found it. Could be 2 pawns up and a time advantage for Lazavik.
Hikaru looks like he might have missed that. Rook takes e3. Everything's defended. 2-pawn advantage, but rook endgames are so tricky.
He just has to find shelter for his king. Then he can start pushing. Check.
Here come the checks.
Rook g7, there's f6.
That's
Maybe
right.
double the rooks.
Oh, this looks really
checkmate.
bad. That's checkmated too. And Denis Lazavik bounces back with the white pieces to equalize in almost a similar fashion